I feel like this is a wellspring of hot takes and also strong opinions.
Yes, indeed.
100% factual information on the side of every box.
Hey there, Mike Dunn with another episode of Tabletop Throwdown. Once again, I've got Dan Hinken with me. Mark would be with us, but he is, I don't even think he has internet yet. He just moved from, I think it was Florida to Tennessee. And I'm actually about to do the same thing, but not quite as far a move. Like, really soon, and I'll talk about that at the end because it will impact the near future of this show. But before we get to all of that, we have a topic tonight that I have been really excited about. We have been working on this topic probably since the beginning of the season. That topic is, it's about this number right here. Yes.
Game duration.
Yes, game duration. The game duration on the side of a game box. Now, we wanted to tackle this topic because frankly, that number hasn't really seemed too accurate. Not in my experience. I don't know about you, Dan. What do you think?
No, I mean, I think it's super subjective. I think it depends on lots of different factors. And so, I think it's interesting to talk about, and we wanted to get some different professionals' ideas about it. And so we got a couple of interviews that we're going to be talking about today. But I really think it depends on the board game. It depends on the group of people you got. And, I've seen ranges from, 20 minutes to 240 minutes, and you never know what's going to fall in between.
Yep. Yeah. And so like Dan said, to that end, for the last several months, we have been collecting hot takes from several luminaries in the board game design community. Some of them also do double duty as publisher, so it was nice to kind of get that take on it as well. Just to kind of give you an idea of who we're talking about. We've got Ammon Anderson. If you haven't heard that name, believe me, you will soon. He is the designer of a game that's going to be coming out at Gen Con this year called Gnome Hollow. We've talked about it a bunch. It was in our very first episode of the season as one of the most anticipated games that we're looking forward to this year. We've got Kevin Wilson, who we just interviewed on our last episode of the podcast about Kinfire Kinfire Council, the current Kinfire game that is on Kickstarter right now. And that was great because he's got a very long background in game design. He was one of Asmodee's main game designers for a considerable amount of time before he struck off on his own, and then eventually helped found Incredible Dream. And then we've got Jason Matthews. Just a little quick one from Jason Matthews. If you don't know who Jason Matthews is, he is the designer of Twilight Struggle. He's a history game. His big thing is history games. He's working very closely with Fort Circle now. Actually, he might even co-own it. He's part of Fort Circle Games now. And then finally, we're going to cap it off with a really long, just candid discussion with Drew and Cole Werhle of Whirligig Games, and of course Cole also is with Leader Games. That I got to say, that was a very special moment. We got to sit down with them at Gamma. I've been waiting anxiously to get this footage out there because I think it's a great discussion.
Mhm.
And they have all of these folks have some fantastic opinions.
Mhm.
So yeah, Dan, before we dive in, um, any thoughts? Any of your own thoughts on that game duration?
Yeah, I like I said, I think it's subjective, and I think it's gonna be a matter of who you got at the table. Because
Right.
we have some friends who just have some serious AP, analysis paralysis that take
Oh, yeah.
twice as long for a turn. You got to take into account. Is it a new player? Is it somebody who's playing games before? Is their first time? How much fun are you guys having? We played a game. We played a game just Saturday, or just the other day, where the box said 60 to 90 minutes. This is a new game that's coming out to Kickstarter called Winds of New Masera, which was a blast. But it probably took longer because of how much laughter we were having and how much fun we were having with the game, and also just the questions. Because I had played the game a couple times. You guys had not. I had to teach you guys the game, which didn't take very long, but there was some nuances and things throughout. So there's lots of different factors that come into game time. So I guess the big question is, how do we determine what goes on the side of a box? And and what do publishers do?
And so that's why I have so many questions, man. Like first of all, who comes up with that number?
Right.
And it might not be the same at every company, right? In some cases it might be the designer, in other cases it might be the marketing department, right? Like,
it's true.
There are certain marketing concerns to be thought of when dealing with game duration. It's something that a consumer might consider when they're buying a new game.
It's true.
And does that include the teach? Like, my guess is no way. Does it include the teach? Why not? Why don't we have a time for the teach? I think that would be a cool thing to do. And yeah, who is this number really for anyway?
Right.
And so we ask these questions of all these folks, and we get their answers, and I think it's fascinating how much they agree and what they agree on, and how much they disagree and what they disagree on as well. Without further ado, let's dig in. Kevin, I would love to hear your opinion on that little bit on the side of a game box. You've made a lot of games for Fantasy Flight, and now for Incredible Dream, and also kind of on your own freelance. How much input do you have into that number, and what does that number mean to you?
Well, honestly, pretty much all my games, the number on the side of the box has been the number I've given the publisher. So it's always been,
Okay.
I've always been the one to determine that number. As for what it means to me, first of all, I'm going to say your teaching game, your learning game doesn't count. Like, there's no way we want to put like the double long play length of that like first game on the side of the box. Nobody wants that. That would be terrible to try and plan your game night around, which is really, to me, what the point of the play length in there really is on the side of the box. Is like, okay, we have 4 hours of gaming that we're going to do Wednesday night. What all do I want to try and plan to fit into that length? And so try to give a reasonably realistic number there. Some groups have analysis paralysis fiends that are just going to like double the length of every game they play. I can't help you if that's your group. Sorry. Some groups are going to zip through things. Some groups stop for dinner. If you take a dinner and a movie break in the middle of the game, that doesn't count as part of the playtime. Sorry.
No, it doesn't.
Like I've had folks tell me that like Descent went on for like 8 hours, or Arkham went on for 8 hours, and it was like, did you stop for dinner and a movie? Like, what happened? Because I've done like 8-player games of Arkham at conventions, and kept that to a reasonably dull roar, and so it's impossible to really predict what any given group, how they're going to react to a game and how long it's going to take. So you just kind of estimate how long you've generally seen the game take,
Right.
and you do your best and you try to provide it as a useful tool for folks with the understanding that every group is different and every number is going to fluctuate like that. So
Now, when you're designing a game, do you have a target duration that you shoot for sometimes?
always. I always know how long I want the game to be, and that depends a lot on kind of where the market is. And I've been doing board games for like 20 years now, and that number fluctuates. When I was first doing this, players were a lot more all about the long, epic games at that point. And then kind of that audience aged, they got families, they got out of college. Suddenly, instead of having so much in terms of like weekend games, now a lot of groups shifted to weeknight games, and that's just a different style of thing. And these days, you really want to try and keep it under 2 hours, generally speaking. Like a mid to heavy game needs to be about 1 to 2 hours, somewhere in there. If you go longer than that, you're really limiting, who's going to play your game a lot of times. And if you have kind of an under an hour game, you can kind of get into even more things. But a game experience takes time too. Like there were a lot of advertisements at one point of like, here's the Civilization game that you can play in under an hour, kind of thing. And I was always like, okay, well, what kind of Civilization game is that? And what can I actually experience of that type of game in under an hour? Like,
Right.
is there really going to be an arc to that game of any sort? Like, it takes time to tell a story. It takes time to experience growth in a game and to, have a gameplay arc, really. So you have to like you have to be kind of realistic about what you're trying to cram into a given length of game.
And also something else that we've been hearing has been that there are marketing concerns around that number too, right? Like do you think there's like a duration that is just it's a killer? Like maybe this won't work in more of like a big box store as opposed to an LGS, right? Like I think there's some publishers out there that are like, oh, a game can't be more than 2 hours. Like we won't even publish it if it's more than 2 hours, right?
Absolutely.
But yeah, you're right. Like back in the 80s, like a board game was an all day affair. Almost every single game that I played. Whereas now, like on any given Saturday, I'm playing like 3 or 4 games, unless like we come into it knowing, all right, we're going for the long haul on this baby.
Right.
Very cool. Very cool. So, do you feel like the durations that you put on your boxes, do you feel they're more accurate than stuff that you've seen?
I don't know about more accurate, but I do my best on it. I think most designers do their best on it, and it's just a matter of making your best guess and hoping that it comes out, kind of works out for most people. So yeah, I will say there's probably some marketing pressure in some cases, and I have had publishers tell me like they're not interested in games over 2 hours long, and that's according to their business model and such.
Right.
And so I think it's one of those things where you kind of have to take that number on the side of the box with a little bit of grain of salt and an understanding that like if your group plays a bit slow, that number is going to be longer. If your group is fast, it'd be shorter.
So Jason, what are your thoughts about the game duration time on the side of a game box? Like, how do you come at it? Like, where do those numbers come from?
I mean, what's odd about that question is having designed a lot of games for a lot of different companies, It seems to be a bolt from God that no one quite knows precisely how those numbers are assigned. I feel like maybe on one or two occasions, someone asked me at some point in the development process how long this game was going to take. But I can say with absolute certainty that I have never given a definitive answer to go on the back of a box for any company I've ever dealt with.
Wow.
And that's kind of weird to think.
Yeah.
And so now that I'm working with Fort Circle, I look forward to also assigning a random number to the back of somebody else's box.
Well, do you think about game duration in the design process? Like how much does that impact what you're doing?
For me, it is kind of a core part of my design process, because I do kind of two things right up front. I find the book, whatever the book is, because I'm usually doing something historical. So I read the book, and then I define the parameters of the game right from the start. So I'll be like, I want this to take 2 hours. I need a map board about this size. If it's going to have cards, it's going to have this many cards. And then I design from those guardrails. So, and I'll work backwards. Well, playing a card takes this many seconds, and so therefore I can only have this many cards if I'm trying to get in under 2 hours or an hour and a half or whatever it is the length, the aim of the length is. So yes, it matters very much to me, actually.
So Ammon, today we're talking about game durations and like I guess not recommended, but the average game duration time that appears on the side of most game boxes these days. And we're talking about how we're frustrated by this number because it almost never really pans out. And I have some ideas, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
All right, this is my take. So I think that the game duration is not for a first playthrough. Mm-hmm. So I think your first playthrough, plan on like at least 50% more time to double that amount of time. Just because the first time you play something, you're learning it, you're making mistakes, you may not be playing it correctly. I'm
inclined to think that it doesn't include that teach, right? It's not including the teach.
Not including a teach, but even like the first time you play, like it's going to go longer. Before I form an opinion on a game, I like to play it 3 times. Mm-hmm. So I think like by the 3rd or 4th play of the game, you're probably going to be somewhere there. But I also think that some publishers may like drop that by 15 minutes because it just helps with marketing and sales.
Yeah.
Like if it's a 90-minute game,
that's the thing. Long. That's the thing we're trying to find out, right? Is who's coming up with that number, right? And what is contributing to that duration? And I think we can all agree that the teach is not included, and that there may be some level of marketing pressure. There may be someone somewhere, some trope or way of thinking that says, games within this duration sell better than games within this duration. Right?
No, I think that's actually true. I
think, but the thing that we can also all agree with is that it's a very frustrating number because it not everybody is willing to take the time to play a game 3 times before they settle on that number. I feel like, what if there was a teach time duration on the box?
Oh, that's an interesting thing to put on the back of the box. Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
And I think in general, games these days don't really take into account the overhead of learning and teaching the game. And there's almost always going to be one person at that table teaching one or more people at that game how to play. And I feel like there needs to be some accommodation there. But
Well, there's also, and this might be something interesting to think about. So, like, you have like levels of complexity on games. Like you have like Uno, and you have like Monopoly, and you have
right.
like sort of like really mainstream games. I don't think those people are looking at how long it takes to play a game.
No, I don't think so.
They just pick it up. They're like, "This is interesting. We're gonna play it." And then you have like really, really heavyweight games over here. Like Vital Lacerda game,
right?
Which I love many, by the way. But a Vital game, like no one's thinking about how long that takes.
Yeah,
and like, there's no way. Like, I mean, I don't even know what it says on the side of like on Mars, but like it should say like 3 to 4 hours. Like,
yeah.
At least 2 hours, right? But like if I'm sitting down to play Lacerda, I know that I want to get into a long game, right? Or even like something from Stonemaier, like they're going to be a heavier game. I think the people who actually care about that number, like how long it takes to play, are those people in the middle that are playing those midweight games.
Yep.
And they want to sit down, maybe play with someone who doesn't play a lot of games. And that's when it's important because you're like, hey, you want to play this game? How long does it take? It says on the box an hour. But then if it's not an hour, that person that you kind of like roped into the game is like, hey, man, like an hour and 40 minutes. Like, I can't believe
you tricked me.
So I think it's actually like that middle consumer that cares about that a lot.
Yeah.
Where like heavy gamers are just like, man, we're going to get into this. We're going to play, we're going to play Nucleum all night. This is going to be great.
Well, and I remember when I was getting into games when I was a kid, back in the 80s, like we didn't have that on the box.
Yeah, nobody cared.
I mean, all right, let me rephrase that. I don't recall that being on the box, like, which goes to say that I probably didn't care if it was on the box.
I'm like looking over into my closet.
I know, right? I'm like, let me find some
like,
Steve Jackson, black box games, and I'll let you know.
I don't think
so.
Put it on either. I'm like thinking about that now.
Yeah.
Like, does Uno say how? Like, does Uno even have a time length? I don't know. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Nobody cared about it, but like, time is more valuable now than it was back then.
This is true.
Like back then, like you were like,
and there's a lot more things competing for your time.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Like you couldn't just like Netflix something. Like you knew back when I was a kid, like you had 2 hours between like when your show ended and the next show you wanted to watch came on, and you were just like, there was no cell phone and no internet, so you're like, yeah, Monopoly sounds great. Let's do that. So, yeah. Anyway, that's what I think. I think all of this stuff is probably true to some degree, and there's no real number, and every studio probably does it a little bit differently, and every publisher like looks at it differently. Like, but I know, and I can end my statement with this, and I know we're past what you wanted, but I'll say this: like when I play a game, my game, like Gnome Hollow, right? I can play my game fast at any player count.
Right.
I can play 4 players myself to test the game, and I can buzz through that game in about 35 minutes. Other players, especially because of like the spatial stuff, it depends on who I'm playing with. Like, if a person is spatially challenged, they're going to take longer to play than if I sit down with 4 people who are like very like, ooh, I love spatial puzzles, and they're like, right, and it like all goes together. So I guess like there's not really a great way to define it because every person plays a game a little differently.
Well, and that kind of underscores like one of the points that we've been talking about too, and that is like who is coming up with this number. If it was like you coming up with that number as you're play testing Gnome Hollow, for instance, like the fact that you're teaching the game and you're guiding the experience definitely impacts that duration.
100%. Yeah.
And so like I'm really curious as to like what is the rigor that is being put into these numbers, and that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of.
I guess as game designers and publishers, give us your perspective on that number.
Well, it does mean something,
right?
I mean,
but it's not runtime, right?
no, it's not runtime, and I think what you're getting at, Drew, is that there's no official body. I can't I don't know that I'm going to be home by this point to relieve my babysitter. when I check a game's runtime. But it's usually probably the last bit of data, the last thing that we added on a box before we submit it for publication is probably the duration. It's the very last little note. And it's strange because I think that it's something that, maybe this is a good framing comment, is cared about by people who are just learning the game most. So I think that there's always a little bit of confirmation bias when we talk to people about game runtimes, because they are heavily invested in it when they don't really know the game, or when they're going to buy it, or they've just started playing it. And then once they start playing it, they stop caring about it, even though at that same time, their game times are starting to approach it. Yeah. And so I think part of the problem is that people have strong opinions about it at the precise wrong moments.
Yeah. And also it makes sense if you knew nothing about genre or about designer or publisher and you pick up a thing, it's the closest thing to tell you what kind of game it is.
Right.
Because even box size or weight isn't going to tell you what kind of game you're about to buy or experience. But at least there's a number, and you know that. You know it's 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that experience.
Right. It's become this like weird synecdoche or something for the complexity of a game. Yep. In a world where someone might have spent, $200 on Castles of Burgundy, it's a very heavy, large box with a lot of pieces, and they say, well, how complex is this game? Well, they can look at that playtime and see that it says 20 or 30 minutes per player and say, okay, that's a game I could play in an evening or something like that. So runtime is like the one place where even if players are suspicious of it, I think there's something in them that wants to see to the heart of the game through it. It's being invested with a lot of meaning.
Yeah. And it always gets, the threads start running thin as soon as there's any element of player interaction that could need a bit of negotiation to solve. So as soon as there's something that is not solved by a game timer, our games are not dictated unless it's explicitly by a sand clock.
Right.
There's
a mechanic in the game.
There's going to be a hyphen in there. Yeah. Or you could be so bold to just say a single number.
Yeah. And I feel like it also kind of assumes that everybody knows how to play, right?
Yep.
The one thing that I think we have really kind of definitively determined is that number almost certainly does not include teach time.
For sure.
Right. But what I'd like to find out is how that number is like what calculus or addition or subtraction do you guys use to get to that number?
Well, I'll say that, so I'll give a very short answer, and then I'll give like the longer, slightly more sinewy, strange answer. We observe a lot of games and play a lot of games, and that number is usually almost an explicit average of what we are observing in games by testers. Now, testers aren't people, in many cases, who've played the game 100 times. Mostly testers play the game 5 or 6 times, and then there's a general attrition. And so people get a competency with the game. I like to look at that number as like, if there were no rules questions, or if there was a minimum number of rules questions, how long is the game going to take? And so we're using that to figure out where the number is. But it's obviously not a pure average, because obviously there's a lot of games that are 60-minute, 90-minute, 75-minute. These are awfully round and suspicious numbers for anything like an average.
Right.
And that's because there is the other thing a game time represents, which is that when we sit down to work on a game, very early on, before the game is done at all, we have a target in mind. We think about this game as a 60-minute game, or as a 90-minute game, or as a 2-hour game. And as we are developing the game, we're making choices to keep that time down to that length. So Pamir is an interesting example for us, because we knew very early on that we wanted Pamir to be a 2-hour or less game. And there are some exceptions. We knew that, like, okay, in a larger game, it's going to drift up a little bit. In a 2-player game, it's obviously going to be pretty small. But as we're developing the game, we're making lots of conscious decisions about game length. I mean, I think we think about game length as much as any person making a movie thinks about runtime. It's just we have we can't look at the bottom right of our Final Cut Pro and see what our current
and say exactly we got the 90-minute comedy. Right. We're operating within ranges, and communicating that number range is spread across player count, but that it not necessarily means that player count is the thing that's driving the clock of the game, because some of the, again, our games also have odd timing windows for game completion. It could be a fourth or a third as long as the next game that you play. And including that is a part of this average or style that the runtime represents is important. That's speaking in the same words of genre.
And I think it's especially hard for things that we work on because they tend to include a lot of novel mechanisms. When I sit down to play a Rosenberg game, I can look at the game time that's on the box and think, we're going to hit this within 2 plays. Or probably we're going to be going even faster.
Right.
I hardly need to read a rule book to play a new Rosenberg game because they borrow so many mechanisms from themselves. That isn't the true for anything that we work on. We've had this problem a little bit with Arcs. I mean, it's not a problem. The game's not even out yet. But Arcs, I think, is listed as a 90-minute game on the box for the base experience of Arcs. And new players will probably have, especially for certain group temperaments, a 3-hour game, which is not great. Like, I think Arcs is it's my best work in a 90-minute game. I wouldn't sit down and play a 4-hour game of Arcs. But that's part of the work that you have to do to sort of learn the game and get into it. Once players get a handle on the game time drops way down, right to where it should be. And of course, that brings to us to the central problem of this whole thing, which is that game groups are different.
Yeah.
And that, I think that there's always a sense, it is the classic sociological bias of thinking that you yourself are in the mean of the mean, you're the most average player, or maybe a little above average. And in point of fact, having observed a lot of groups play Root or play Pamir, play John Company, we run into John Company players who routinely play the game in 2 hours or 3 hours. I also run into people who only play it as an 8-hour event game. And they're both playing the same game. They're both actually having a good experience playing it. But there's no way to control for that on a box lid, right? I mean, I really just want to tell people, play it until you're done playing it.
Right.
Yeah, so I think you really hit the nail on the head with everyone thinks my experience is representative of the norm. Because I've been in really 2 extremes of game groups, coming from a group where I played with the same 4 guys every Tuesday and we played the same games. So the box times were pretty accurate because we're not learning a new game. And then I've been in a game club where you show up to a game store, you're almost always playing with somebody you've maybe never played before. At least one person hasn't learned the game ever. You have to teach the game, you have rules questions, and that's how you end up with that 3-hour experience for a 90-minute game. So that might be where a lot of the
And then there's games like the classic Dune, where it could take all day or it could end in 30 minutes, right?
Well, and Dune is really my favorite example because I do think that oftentimes we default into thinking that the shorter game is a little bit better. People are always happy. I mean, actually, one of the most interesting things in watching the release of Last Light last year was after people would play the game, I would talk to them and say, "Oh, how was that game you just played?" And they're like, "Oh, so fast." I'm like, that's just a weird way to describe a game.
Right.
Was it fun?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was like I just finished eating a beautiful meal. It's like I'm digesting this thing as fast as possible. I can't believe it. And I started thinking. I mean, Dune is really a great interlocutor here because the long games of Dune are actually better.
Yeah.
Dune is a bad 30-minute to 90-minute game, and it's a
Very
great
unsatisfying.
3-hour plus game. And usually when I talk to people about Dune, if they tell me they don't like it, I'm like, how long was your game? They're like, I don't know, an hour or something. I'm like, that's why you didn't like it.
Yeah, right.
Because you didn't have time to get to the weird scrappy Dune.
And it makes me wonder what Gale Force 9 put on the box. And I don't know if they put 20 minutes to 4 hours or whatever, right?
Right. And I mean, also, when I first started gaming, back in the 80s, long games were the norm. Super long games. You blocked out a day to play Axis and Allies or to play Diplomacy or something like that. Now, I do think, I do find that games that when they talk about time, duration, the ones that kind of say X per hour, right? No, X per player, X amount per player. Those tend to be a little more accurate, or at least give you an idea of the variability of gameplay depending on how many players there are.
Yeah, if your range, you said this is a 1 to 5 player game, and you say it's 90 minutes, well, the solo player might take 45 minutes, and then a 5-player game might take 2.5, 3 hours.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes when that happens, it feels like the design is determining that sort of direction for game length. So it's specifically wrapped around games that have such a predictable pattern of play that someone could then say boldly 25 minutes per player.
Well, and it has to do with like the quality of the decisions too, because if you, and I'll use like a Rosenberg game as an example, you could almost imagine Uwe saying like, oh, every action is going to take 2 minutes. You're going to take 15 actions. That's 30 minutes per player. You just kind of like stack them all up. And what that doesn't account for is the emergent properties a game can have. And of course, even in a game like Larve or in Agricola, there are moments where you're like, oh, I have to reevaluate everything because of what you just did. And that's certainly meaning that because we're playing a 4-player game, there's more chaos that has to be attended to. We actually run into the almost opposite version of this at John Company, because John Company has this almost the same number of actions regardless of player count. But it does take longer at higher player counts because there is more of that emergent property. There's more negotiation tabletop.
It is not about actions take X minutes and more words that will be said above the table, spread across how many hours.
One of the things I've heard is also that that number is more of a marketing. There's more of a marketing approach taken to that number. Like, what do you guys think of that? How is that something that you keep in mind when you come up with that number too?
Well, when we're working from a premise that we want to make a 90-minute space game or something, that is a marketing concern, but it is happening at the level of design. And so I think that, I would separate two impulses. One of them is, let's say we worked on a game for a long time that was supposed to be a 90-minute, game about selling fruit. And it was kind of more of like a 2.5-hour game. And now we're at a funny spot where we have to ask ourselves, do we want to be a little dishonest on this box and kind of like futz that number? And I do think some publishers, not going to name names, do that. And it's self-evident. It hardly needs to be done. You can walk around a store and be like, how did they
get there?
This?
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with this disconnect where they're like, oh, the marketing team was promised something from the creative team. And the creative team delivered something like maybe a little bit different. For us, we're really primarily just trying to be honest with the players about their expectations. And so, and this is also, we can frame that as a marketing concern, right? Marketing is all about managing the expectations of a player. Right. Drew and I run into this, and also we run into it at Leader, where we try really hard to be extremely honest with the players. And this comes from, I'm not meaning to share a trade secret, but our core belief at both companies is that I would rather have someone not buy the game than buy the game and hate it.
Sure.
And so a lot of times when I'm at a convention or talking to a retailer here at Gamma, I will tell people not to buy a game. I'll say, look, you are looking for actually Everdell and not Root. And I need to make sure that if you're hunting for Everdell, you get Everdell and not Root. Because I would hate to have you buy this game and then get very mad and then go online and start spewing stuff that is mostly about the fact that something didn't meet your expectations and not about the quality of the thing itself.
Right.
And likewise, when Drew and I are working on historical games, we're really clear where it's like, hey, John Company is a negotiation game, which means you're going to be talking to each other. It also deals very frankly with risk, which means you're going to be rolling dice and surprising and upsetting things are going to happen.
Yeah.
And I feel like when we can be completely honest with people, the playtime then becomes just another tool in describing the shape of the thing.
It happens to be a number, but it has so many qualitative aspects of how it's described in a marketing like front and interfaces with how mechanics and category and genre are actually represented inside something that looks as blatant and not variable as player count, right?
Well, in John Company, I think, is it 120 to 240 on the box? I think it's 2 to 4 hours is how we framed it, which I feel really good about that timing. I think that when players know the shorter scenarios, they can reliably get them done in about 2 hours. The longer scenarios take closer to 4 or 5. It depends on how gabby the group is. It's like the big controller. And that may seem, I think other publishers, like if we were pitching this to Asmodee or WizKids or whatever, they might say, look, we are not going to put 4 hours on a game box. It's going to scare them away. And what I want to tell them is, how long was your last D&D session?
Yeah.
Because in the world of role-playing, they didn't leave the 80s. They're still like, it's role-playing night. We're going to play one game. It's going to take 6 hours, and we're all going to go home bleary-eyed.
And we're not going to be done.
Yeah.
We're going to come back again in a week or two.
Sometimes I'll look at a war game, and the war game will be, the war games can be very brusque and almost silly about playtime. It will say, this war game takes 3,600 hours or whatever. A lot of these like insane, or 3,600 minutes. And I'll think like, well, that's insane. But also, like, that's probably a D&D campaign.
Yeah.
Like, if we're being really honest about how long we're, like, in states of play, role-playing games are in orders of magnitude higher than board games.
Well, and I also wonder how much, now that more hobby games are entering the mainstream markets, like the big box stores, how much kind of influence that distribution chain is having on what that number ends up being, right?
Yeah. Well, I always think about the worst position to be in is to be a publisher sitting on the shelf, a box next to another box, and they're both like €2 with a similar kind of theme, and one of them takes half as long to play.
Right.
And as a customer, I'm going to probably pick the faster one. And I think that can lead to and this is where you get into the marketing component and the potential dishonesty of run times, because a shorter play time is a marketplace advantage in certain market segments. Yeah. Thankfully, they're not market segments where we hang out.
Right.
Yeah, but on the flip side of that, a lot of people measure the value of the games they buy by how much time they spend playing them, right? So.
Yeah, so with that marketing aspect, different people use that number differently. You might say, I'm looking for a 60-minute experience, so I'm going to go get the 60-minute game. Versus like my personal play style is I like complex, big, epic games. I want to sit down for a long time, and I'm using that runtime for like, is this game going to meet the complexity of something that I want to play?
Sure.
Right. So something that says this takes 45 minutes, to me that says this is a simple game that I'm not interested in. Even it might be amazing,
right?
But something says it takes 120 minutes. I go, oh, this might be something juicy that I can have an experience with.
Well, and this is a place where you can see publishers start to ape from the world of video games, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because you'll see a campaign which will advertise itself with 40 hours of gameplay or 60 hours. And I think like Sleeping Gods does this, also Frosthaven, where they're like, look at how, they're acting as if it's a AAA video game, which is fine, but they are directing towards a different market segment.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, so like this is clearly something with a lot of ambiguity and a lot of fuzziness, right, to it. Is there a better way to do this? Is there a better way to communicate this to players, to potential consumers, people who buy the games?
I feel like there's an interesting exercise we did at Leader a few years ago where we were trying to measure the output of the studio. It was like a funny problem. It's like, okay, we all work on these games. How do we measure the work that we've done? How do we compare something like Oath to something like Fort? And after a long time, we were like, oh, what if we just use the MSRPs? Which feels like almost too easy. Mm-hmm. I'm like, well, the MSRPs are a reflection of the scope of the project and a lot of other things. And actually, it's a pretty good measurement for creative output because broadly, Oath's MSRP is $120, Fort is $30. And Oath was 4 times as much work, probably more than Fort. And that's like a pretty good way of measuring it. And I kind of feel the same way about game time and complexity.
Yeah.
Because I think that we can find more precise ways of describing how long a game takes. We can say it's X minutes per player, plus X amount of time if your group's chatty or whatever. We can do all that. But there is to me some value in the clarity of being like, this is a 90-minute game. And what I'm communicating with that is that when you get experience with the game, it's going to take around 90 minutes to play. And it's less complex than a game that's maybe 2 hours long or 3 hours long. And so I'm on the side of loving game times. I think it's a noisy metric, but it still means something. It's a noisy piece of data.
And it tells you about what could have happened also after you play it. Mm-hmm. Like this could have been twice as long or 4 times as short.
Well, and the reason why I like it as a way of thinking about complexity and also like the general, let's call it the like temporal footprint of the game, right? Because one thing I like about it is that we have no better way of measuring those things. Because, for example, rulebook length. Some of the best rulebooks that have come out recently, I'm thinking about the Daybreak rulebook, is exceptionally long. The Daybreak rulebook, I think, is longer than any rulebook I've worked on except John Company. But it's long because it goes through the concepts very slowly. It's beautifully illustrated. It's fun to read. It's like reading like a light magazine. And so I would never want to measure like a game's complexity by like the words in a rulebook. But I can look at Daybreak, and I'm sure Daybreak's box says 90 minutes. I feel like it's a little shorter in practice, but they might be edging they might be on the high side of that. And I can compare Daybreak with something like Lacerda's CO2, where I am sure the playtime on CO2, I hope I don't have to eat my words. You can have a little pop-up here. I know it's going to be higher than Daybreak, or it should be higher than Daybreak, and it reflects the complexity of that game in comparison to the other.
Right.
So I want more game times.
You know what I want? I want teach times. Teach times would be awesome.
Yes, I think that's the right way of thinking through this problem, because John Company, let's say we're playing a 2 to 3 hour game of John Company. I would still put on John Company's box, this is an hour teach.
Yeah.
And I have no, like, it's not something I want to hide from anyone. And I think like Pamir is like a 25-minute teach. And like Arcs is like a 15 to 20-minute teach. And Molly House is probably like a half an hour teach.
Yeah.
And Molly House's game time is much less than John Company. But I think just like having a very straight assessment of teach time really does collapse some of those things. So man, maybe we'll put teach times in our next box.
Awesome. Well, thanks, gentlemen. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us about this.
It's our pleasure. You gave us a good idea.
I know. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic.
Awesome.
Okay, well, so as you can see, a lot of different opinions, a lot of different takes. Honestly, I would love to hear from so many more other designers about this, in particular, like party game designers. Like, didn't talk to any party game designers. I'd be interested to see. I feel like it's a whole different ballgame with where they're concerned, right? Because that is a much like party games are designed to be more bite size and easy to teach and all of that. So I'd be curious to see. Like, we could totally do a sequel to this episode, and maybe we make it a regular thing, and every season update with new impressions and hot takes.
I think I think the one thing that we can come out of this conversation with is that there's no real clear answer other than the fact that I think it means different things to different people, kind of like what we were saying at the top of the episode. It really depends on what you're looking for and really what kind of game is out there. You know, for me, I like the deep chunky games. I like some of those things. And so kind of like what Mark said in one of those interviews, he was talking about like that tells you the longer game time means a little bit more complexity. Whereas a shorter game time may not be something that I always go towards because I kind of like to sit down. However, you know, like you said, it's a weeknight game. You know, I'm playing more and more with those with my wife. And so we're looking for like an hour long or like a 45 minutes to an hour. But sometimes, you know, once you've gotten into a game, that game time changes depending on who you're playing with. You know, me and my wife can get through, you know, 3 games of My City in an hour, or, you know, a couple rounds of something lighter, just because we know the game. We don't have to worry about the rules. We know the nuances of it. And so it's always going to be a factor. So I think me coming away with it is, you know, I think it's extremely subjective, but I did find it very interesting, especially some of the marketing things that you were bringing up and some of the questions you were asking in some of those interviews.
Yeah, I gotta say, I went into this topic largely thinking that, I don't know, almost feeling betrayed by that number on the side of the box, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, I do have a I know I lifted it up earlier, but I know Drew mentioned it. He was musing about like what the time duration on the side of the box is for Dune, and 120 plus minutes. So they don't even comp to the fact that it could end in a half hour. But like I went into this thinking that it was largely unreliable data, right? And I gotta say that conversation with Cole and Drew, Cole made a really good case for that duration, that time duration. Like I found I was, it kind of turned me around a bit. And then I think the thing that really intrigued me a lot was when some of the folks that we talked to talked about instead of like figuring out what the duration is like after you've gone through a good chunk of the design of the game, that they kept that duration in mind from the beginning, and it helped shape the design of the game. But I do think it would be really cool if publishers and designers started putting something about the teach, right? Like, I really do hope that Whirligig starts doing that. I will totally take credit for that idea, and expect kudos from those guys. But I think that would be super helpful, especially to the players, right?
Well, and I think there's a lot that goes into the information on the side of the box. The thing that kept coming to my mind was like, hey, what do we really need on the side of the box? Does game duration tell us what we really need to know, or is it something that could be we could expand upon it? Like, is there a complexity rating that we need to do? Is there a mechanics little list that we could do, like some kind of standardized thing across industry that have this little box that shows this is the kind of game, these are the kinds of things that you're going to see, this is the complexity? Because you could have a 60-minute game that could be super complex because you're only doing a couple things in that 60 minutes, and it burns your brain. Think about like a Turing machine or something, like some of those things that doesn't take very long to play, but still got a complexity. So I don't know.
Yeah, because time and complexity aren't always like associated with each other, right? I think it would be cool. Man, I'm blanking on what I was going to say. Oh. Yeah, so they kind of tried to do that with video games years ago. I remember there was a lot of like iconography and like some stuff that they were trying to do. And, having worked on the categorization systems of Gamingtrend back in the early 2000s when we were video game centric and we were trying to basically replicate everything on the back of a video game box. The problem with that is that there are people always coming up with games that defy categorization, right?
Sure.
Which I think to a certain extent also speaks to how tabletop games, how board game design is an art, right? Like it's not always easily categorized, and even some of the terminology that we use for categorization is misleading or doesn't tell enough of a story. Like I remember. Like when I took over tabletop for the site 6 years ago, or even before that, when Keith was in charge of tabletop, and he was like, we need to put game weights on, and I was like, game weights? What the heck are you talking about? I wasn't a BGG guy. I didn't really go there. Like most at that point in my life, most of my tabletop gaming had been done like in the 80s and early 90s, when I was like a teenager and in my early 20s. So I was like, that just seems like it to me, game weight, especially at that time, seemed like something that someone who had no idea what it was would get confused by. Right. And it took me a little bit of digging to find out what those weights actually meant. I would say to this day, and it's probably largely because a lot of this is crowdsourced on BGG. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the weights that show up, but it's kind of it's better than nothing metric, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's like, how do you, one person's like 4 is another person's 2, right? It's so subjective. So, I think we need to just, consign ourselves to the fact that it's going to be an imperfect metric. The only perfect metric, and it's not even that perfect, is player count.
Right.
Right.
I mean, but then you can add a solo mode in or cooperative, and then it's just we can muddy the waters, and we could go into the
right, and like, it remains to be seen if that solo mode, or if like a two player iteration of what really should be only a 4 or 5 player game, for instance, or 3 or 4 player game. Like, no, you don't want to play it at 2 player. That's
right.
Meaningless.
Exactly.
So
but then there's some games that do a great job of scaling to player count, and they make the game there. But how are you supposed to know that from the side of the box without some of the information? So there's so many different ways that we could skin this cat, and we could talk, and we could go down lots of different rabbit trails. But at the end of the day, I think you got to figure out what's your best method for picking a game. What do you need for the situation, and who's your group, and who you're playing with, and what's your outcome. At the end of the day, it's getting a game to the table and having some fun. And I think there's lots of tools out there that could help you, but you kind of got to figure out your system, and don't rely on one or the other, for sure.
Yep.
So.
But hey, you know what? You don't just have to take our word for it. You could chime in too.
That's true. Let us
know in the comments. Email us at tabletopthrowdown@gamingtrend.com. We'd love to hear from you. I'd like to hear if people like the format of the show. I think, honestly, I think this is probably going to end up being one of our best shows, just because we've been working on it so long, and I've been thinking about it so long, and so I'm really excited to see what people think of it. But I was alluding to this at the beginning of the show. I am also moving, so this is going to be our last episode of Tabletop Throwdown for about a month. We'll let everybody know when we can get back on, but I am going to be out of pocket for the next 3 weeks, and then we're going to Origins. And we're going to be doing lots of interviews and demos at Origins. We'll actually have a booth at Origins. So if you happen to go to Origins, come by and say hi. Please get a sticker. I'll give you a bunch of stickers.
And maybe we'll even have a little segment where we can get your thoughts on camera and get you something. We're trying to figure out what we want to do, but just some different topics and things like that. And if there's any topics that you want us to cover on the show, put those in the comments too. Just the more feedback we can get, the better. And make this what you guys want to listen to. So.
Yeah, and actually, you know what? I'm going to. Our booth number is 145. We are booth 145 at Origins. So come by and say hi. And otherwise, we will be back with another episode. I'm pretty sure it's going to be an Origins wrap-up episode.
Probably,
I ordinarily I'd like to do what we're looking forward to at Origins episode. But it's just not, it's logistically not possible. I don't even think my new studio and my new house will be set up by then. So.
It's true.
But yeah, you were gonna say something, Dan?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, just come by and see us. We'd love to, and then we'll play a game or something in the evening, and we just want to hear from you guys and see what we can do to serve you guys better. So, thanks for listening.
Yeah, and if you have any things that you want us to ask designers or publishers or anything, let us know. We might turn it into an episode. So, definitely want to do more fun topics like this going forward. So, come back in a month. We'll be back, and we might even have some surprises. So, but until then, thanks again.
See you guys.